everyone! Your regularly scheduled programming will begin shortly, but I just wanted to start this video by making sure everyone knows that this channel is pro-trans people. So if you feel differently, feel free to fuck right off and go watch something mind-numbing and prejudiced like Classically Abby or Girl Defined. Sound good? Great. Hi everyone! I'm Luna. Welcome to the Lunarium. As I'm sure many of you know, trans rights are under attack. I can't speak for the rest of the world, but here in America, the erosion of trans people's rights has become a pet issue of the right. Transphobia seems to be spreading at an alarming rate, helped along by public figures who seem to treat demonizing trans people as a badge of honor. I'm really concerned about what's happening to the trans community, and I think you should be too. According to The Guardian, Republicans have introduced anti-trans legislation in at least 25 states. More than 80 bills have been filed that attempt to regulate the rights and lives of trans people, giving 2021 the dubious honor of having the highest number of proposed anti-trans laws in a single year, and it's only April. It seems like every week there's a new piece of legislation introduced somewhere in the country that attempts to target trans people. Like, when I started writing the script, I was really concerned about this bill that was introduced in Arkansas that banned gender-affirming care for minors. That bill has since been made into law, by the way, and only 2 weeks after Arkansas banned trans women and girls from competing in women's sports. Before I could finish writing the script for this video, there was already a new horrifying anti-trans piece of legislation that I was terrified would pass. This one in North Carolina, which is somehow even worse than Arkansas's. When I actually finished the script, there was already a new terrifying piece of legislation introduced, this time in Texas, which would make it so that any adult who helped a minor access gender-affirming care would be designated a child abuser. I'm terrified about what's going to come next. Almost all of the proposed legislation focuses on one of two things, either trans athletes competing against cis minors in sports, or trans youth accessing gender-affirming care. Now, why, you might be asking, are so many legislatures across very diverse states suddenly so concerned about trans athletes competing in school sports or teenagers taking puberty blockers? Is there some sort of national epidemic of trans athletes stealing victory away from cis athletes? Is there some kind of nefarious phenomenon where teenagers are changing their gender at will and for no reason? Are the transgenders coming for your children? No. Obviously, the answer is no. Trans youth are estimated to make up only 0.7 to 2% of our nation's youth. And yet, coincidentally enough, legislation has been introduced across the country focused on the apparently pressing problem of, hold on, let me check my notes. Trans children and teenagers existing. Except, of course, it's not a coincidence. This recent wave of anti-trans legislation appears to be a coordinated effort led by anti-LGBTQ+ organizations and conservative advocacy groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom. The Guardian states, Fred Deutsch, a South Dakota Republican state representative, said he had introduced anti-trans legislation after attending a summit on protecting children from sexualization hosted by the Conservative Heritage Foundation and featuring the ADF. Deutsch has said he shared draft legislation with lawmakers in other states. So regardless of whether conservative lawmakers are being influenced by the same groups or they're sharing ideas for legislation amongst one another, all of these anti-trans bills are part of a larger Republican ploy specifically designed to target trans youth. What's so galling about this whole thing is that most Republicans don't care whether some teenagers take hormones. We know that most Republicans don't believe that they're actually helping children by denying access to gender-affirming care. We know that most Republicans couldn't care less whether your daughter's soccer league contains some trans athletes. So why are they introducing all of these bills? The horrible answer is the fact that trans youth are some of the most marginalized people on the planet. Trans people are the most vulnerable members of the LGBTQ+ community and the most mistreated. Children and teenagers are not given a legal voice in our society, which makes it extremely difficult for them to advocate for their own well-being. This is especially true of trans children and teenagers, who, in addition to being young, have to face discrimination and invalidation. The truth is that conservatives are targeting trans children and teenagers because they're easy targets, and because they can. And also because trans people make them uncomfortable. I'm sure they'd deny it if asked, but most conservatives are very uncomfortable with the idea of trans people. To acknowledge the legitimacy of trans people means to undermine the whole gender paradigm upon which they believe society is built upon. Even worse than the existence of trans people for these conservatives, though, is the idea of trans people existing who aren't easily identifiable as trans people. That's part of the reason why so many conservatives are so focused on preventing children from accessing puberty blockers, because blockers make it easier for trans people to pass as their real gender. And that terrifies conservatives. Targeting trans youth is a recycled tactic from the anti-LGBTQ+ playbook we'll call, "But what about the children?" It's the same argument they made against gay marriage. They're not prejudiced. They just worry about what being raised by two parents of the same sex will do to a child. They're not homophobic. They're just worried that legalizing gay marriage will confuse and corrupt impressionable children. But then something horrible happened. Obergefell versus Hodges came along and legalized gay marriage. And the children were fine. Most of society either celebrates or is indifferent to gay marriage, and to feel otherwise is seen as homophobic. So the anti-LGBTQ+ crowd needed to find a new target to disguise their bigotry, a new supposed threat to the children. And they found trans people. So now I'm not transphobic, I just think children and teenagers are too young to make life-altering decisions about delaying puberty or taking hormones. Now I don't have a problem with trans people, I just think that children should get to play sports on a level playing field. Now I have a cousin who's trans, I just think women should get to feel safe in single-sex spaces. But it all comes from the same place. A desire to erase LGBTQ+ people from society. If you don't believe me, just look at that anti-trans piece of legislation in North Carolina that I talked about earlier. SB 514, or the Youth Health Protection Act, is a draconian piece of legislation that would ban gender-affirming care for anyone under the age of 21, despite the fact that North Carolina's age of consent is 16. As if that wasn't enough, the bill also requires that all government and school employees notify parents in writing if their children display gender dysphoria, gender nonconformity, or otherwise demonstrates a desire to be treated in a manner incongruent with the minor's sex. And that is incredibly disturbing. What is gender nonconformity? A girl playing football? A boy wearing a skirt? There's no clear standard for how to treat someone in a manner congruent with their sex. And that kind of vague language reads to me like an open invitation to target any minor who acts in any way outside of the cis-straight hegemonic ideals people deem as normal. The bill also prevents prohibiting or punishing anyone from providing counsel, advice, guidance, or any other speech or communication, whether described as therapy or provided for a fee, consistent with conscience or religious belief. In other words, the bill expressly allows for conversion therapy. Bills like this aren't just targeting trans people. They're targeting queerness. That doesn't change the very real impacts that this kind of anti-trans legislation and social discourse has on trans youth and adults. Regardless of why conservatives are targeting trans people are being used as political pawns in the culture wars. Every anti-trans piece of legislation, every article written proposing a compromise on the trans question, every social media post decrying the loss of women's rights, is an attack on the very right of trans people to exist and thrive. I've seen countless Twitter posts over the last couple weeks written by trans people saying that they feel like they're under attack and that no one is defending them. I can only imagine what it feels like to be trans right now. Look, to tell you the truth, I struggled a lot to write this script because I just don't get this. Transphobia is bad. I shouldn't need to make a video explaining that transphobia and transphobic legislation is bad, right? We should just all be on the same page about this. But in case the safety and well-being of trans people isn't enough of a reason for you to care about this issue, let me try and convince you. And I'd like to start by addressing any of my queer siblings watching this video. This is our issue too. What affects some members of our community affects all of us. Not only do we owe trans people for all of the strides in equality and acceptance that the cis members of the LGBTQ+ community have enjoyed over the last couple decades, but the bigots won't stop at trans people. Their eventual goal is to eliminate all of us. So if you really don't care about trans people, which would make you a terrible person, by the way, but if you really don't, care about the eventual threat to yourself. As for my viewers who aren't part of the LGBTQ+ community, care about this because it needs to be cared about. Trans rights are under attack, and they're going to continue to be under attack until enough of us can stand together and show the bigots that we won't tolerate them anymore. And also, care about this because it's the right thing to do. Trans rights aren't a threat to anyone else's rights. That's not how rights work. The happiness and existence of trans people doesn't threaten the happiness and existence of cis people. This is a social justice issue that will eventually fall to the way of equality. You're going to want to say that you are on the right side of history once transphobia is finally a thing of the past. All right, have I convinced you to care about this yet? I hope so, because here's what you can do. Contact your elected representative. Call or email and let them know that you're very concerned about the well-being of trans people, and especially that you support gender-affirming care for minors. This is especially important if you live in a red state, or if your state is considering adopting anti-trans legislation. Also, if you're a parent, make sure that your children's school board or administration hears that you and other parents support transgender students. That means contesting any attempts at segregating bathrooms, locker rooms, or sports teams based on assigned sex at birth. Keep an eye on the news to look out for other proposed pieces of anti-trans legislation. If your state is considering adopting one, look for protests in your area. If there is one, go. Stand up for trans people anytime you see them being mistreated. This means in person or online. Anytime you hear an anti-trans talking point, anytime you witness a microaggression, anytime you observe someone being dead-named or misgendered, you call out that behavior and explain why it's unacceptable. I know that that can be uncomfortable, but it's way safer for you to do that than for a trans person to. This is an area where you can use your cis privilege for some real good. Check in on the trans people in your life. This has got to be a really hard time. And every anti-trans piece of legislation or article that makes its way into the news makes it even harder. Ask if there's anything that you can do to help them feel supported and cared for. If you're able, consider donating to an organization that advocates for trans rights, especially ones that advocate for trans youth, such as the Trevor Project, the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund, or the Trans Youth Equality Foundation. Even better, donate some money to a trans person in your life. Being trans can be really expensive. Just existing as a trans person is hard right now. So I think your trans loved one deserves a present. And finally, share this video to spread awareness and encourage other people to stand up for trans lives. Okay, everyone, that's all I have for you today. I didn't spend any time in this video explaining why these anti-trans pieces of legislation aren't scientifically or medically necessary, because I think that's pretty obvious. And if anyone watching feels unsure about any of these issues, feel free to ask questions in the comments. Okay, thank you so much for watching. If you liked this video, please like and subscribe. Please, please, please. I'm trying to grow my channel and it would really, really help me out a lot. As always, please take care of yourselves. Until next time, bye.